Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today we're going to talk about a pet peeve of mine, and that has to do with rods, and more specifically, the fact that there is no universal rod specs to determine what a action or what a rod should be classified as. So what I'm saying is, one company's medium heavy fast action 7.3 rod and another company's medium heavy fast action 7.3 rod don't have to be anywhere in the same ballpark, meaning these companies can really come up with their own specs and they label them as they see fit based upon the rods that they have and how they like to build their rods. I'm totally cool with that. The problem is there's a lot of anglers out there that think that each company's rod specifications are going to be really similar from brand to brand, and that's really not the case. One company's medium heavy might be another company's heavy, might be another company's medium. It could be a moderate speed for one company, but another company calls it a fast. It's just one of those things where the companies have the ability to label the rods as they see fit based on how they like to build it. But there is absolutely zero universal rod grading system that the companies use. There are flex charts, there are different charts that most rod builders and most companies will try to stay within a range of, but there can be a huge difference between one company's heavy action and another company's heavy action. So I want to give you a little bit more background on this and how it's not just as simple as having a rod blank that meets the same criteria. Even if you take the exact same rod blank, and the reality is a lot of companies out there do use the same rod blanks, but after they're done doing the build, the rod action changes dramatically. So that's what we're going to talk about. So the first thing I want to point out has to do just with the guides itself. So let's talk about the guides. If you're running double foot guides, those double foot guides are going to create more strength to the rod, meaning they're going to actually prevent the rod from bending more. So double foot guides versus a single foot guide generally has more the ability to create more stiffness within the rod. So looking at the guides is important. The number of guides, so the more guides you have, generally the more that stiffens up the blank, because you got to remember each guide will have threading, and on top of that threading you've got epoxy. So not only are you creating a bond on that rod that's going to create the rod blank from being able to bend, you're also creating the ability to add stiffness or take away stiffness. So the more guides that you have will make a big difference. And the guide being a single foot, which is what these are, versus a double foot like this one, will also make a difference. But on top of that, it's not just the guides. It also has to do with the amount of thread work and the amount of epoxy you put on. So some companies will carry the thread work significantly further down. You know, I personally, when I make these myself, I take the thread and I just put enough on to cover the foot of the guide. And then when I put epoxy on, the epoxy really might go over the thread work by a 1/16 of an inch, but I like to put as little epoxy and as little thread work on as possible. But some companies out there will not only put a bunch of thread work on the guides, they'll also put a lot of decorative thread work throughout the rod blank. All of that is going to help support the blank and prevent it from bending. So these are little things that you can take to determine when you pick up a rod and compare two rods, hey, this, even though this is a medium heavy, this might actually be more of a heavy or more of a medium when you compare it to a different rod blank or one that you like. The other thing with that is I personally like to add a lot of guides. So the number of guides, as I said, makes a big difference, but I don't think people realize if you add 2 extra guides, you're probably adding a total of almost 2 inches extra of epoxy, and that epoxy is not nearly as forgiving. So you want to count the guides up, you want to look at the amount of thread work, you want to look at the total amount of epoxy that's used on the thread work, you want to look at the type of the guides to see whether the guides are double or single footed. And then once you get down here to the bottom, you can also look at things like your labels. So these are MHX blanks and I like to epoxy over the label. Some companies will epoxy from right where your handle is, or the top grip, whatever they're using, all the way up halfway up the blank. That's a lot of additional epoxy than I do. I just put enough on to cover the MHX label and this rod specs. So in this case, this is the NMB 874 7.3 medium heavy fast action rod. But again, this won't necessarily be the same as a different company. And you also should look at the recommended line as well as weight of the baits that you can throw. Just because in this case, this says you can throw a 12 to 20 pound test and a 1/4 ounce to 1 ounce bait on this rod. That does not mean you can't throw lighter or heavier. These are just suggested specs. So don't think, you know, in this case, if you want to throw a 3/16 ounce weight, you can't do it. In fact, I love to throw 3/16 ounce weights with this rod. So don't take the specs as a hard, fast rule. It's really a recommendation based on the rod builder's use and how they built it to suggest to the angler what they think that's best for. But don't think that that's a hard, fast rule. You won't necessarily even void the warranty if you were throwing a bait that was heavier and broke the rod. But you also have to recall that you need to cast in an appropriate manner. So if you put a 4 ounce big glide bait on this, you might have some pretty big difficulties handling it because the rod's not made for a 4 ounce glide bait. The other things you want to take into account though, and this is a big factor. So for me, I like to have a reel seat that's a little bit lower than what most rod manufacturers will make. And what I mean by that is when I build this rod, my reel seat, where my reel is going to be slightly back the rod a little bit. Most manufacturers would probably have it right about here. Well, the further up that reel goes, the less bend you take out of the rod. So that actually will create, in my opinion, a faster action, stiffer rod blank. One of the reasons I actually like to move it back, I feel like I get a little bit more control out of the rod. But that's just a big thing to take a look at. Not all reel seats are the same length. And when I say same length, they measure it from the rod butt up to the reel seat. So in some cases, some people like to do a 10.5 inch, some people like to do a 15 inch. In the musky world, they like to have that reel way up here because they like to be able to use the butt of the rod to cast and to do figure eights and things like that. But it's all really valuable. And the biggest takeaway from this video just is simply do not walk into the store and think that just because the rod is the same specs as another company's rod that they're going to be the same. They will not be the same. So play around with them. When you find a rod that you like, try to compare that to the other rods. I actually am a big fan a lot of times of, if you're purchasing rods, to try to stay within a series of rods, because those series are generally built on the same type of blank, have similar measurements, and you can create a familiarity with that single rod series versus, say, having 10 rods from 10 different brands. It can be a little bit harder, in my opinion, to get familiar with each of those and understand the differences. But having said that, buy the rods that you feel most comfortable with, take them for a test drive if possible, play around with them, but look at all the components, look at how they're placed on the rod, and that will help give you an idea as to how that rod will perform. Hopefully this was helpful. If it was, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, we'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.